He left her with nothing. Years later, she stunned everyone at her ex's father's will reading. Subscribe to the channel and enjoy my new stories every day. The rain came down in slashing sheets, blurring the outline of the sprawling Silver Creek Rancho against the horizon. Claire Bennett gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale against the leather as her car crawled up the muddy driveway. The rancho stood defiant, a monument to a life she'd been cast out of years ago. It hadn't changed. The grand adobe-style house with its arched windows, the rusted iron gates that had once felt like a promise but now loomed like a warning. She parked near the barn, her headlights catching glimpses of skittish horses in their pens. The storm had unsettled them, and she understood why. This place had a way of stirring the unease buried deep inside. Stepping out into the downpour, Claire pulled her coat tighter, though it did little to shield her. Mud clung to her boots as she walked toward the entrance. Her chest tightened at the sight of the heavy oak doors. She remembered the first time she'd stood there, nervous but hopeful, with Liam's arm around her waist. Now, her chest burned with something sharper, defiance. The past always came in fragments, sharp and uninvited. Driving through the storm to Silver Creek Rancho, Claire had tried to keep her mind blank, but memories crept in like unwelcome shadows. She saw herself at 25, stepping onto the ranch for the first time. The sun had been unforgiving that day, but Liam's smile had been even brighter. He'd taken her hand, leading her through the gates as if he were introducing her to a kingdom she would someday rule. "You'll love it here," he'd promised, his voice dripping with the kind of confidence that made her believe him. And for a while, she did. At first, it had been a dream. The ranch workers treated her with cautious respect, and William, Liam's father, had seemed amused by her awkward attempts to fit into their world. She'd thrown herself into learning how to ride, how to manage accounts, how to host the kind of parties the Bennetts were known for. It had all been for Liam, who had stood by her side with that easy charm that made her heart race. But cracks had formed early on. Little things. A dismissive comment about her small-town manners, the way he brushed off her ideas as cute. Claire had ignored them, convincing herself it was all part of the adjustment. She loved him, and love meant compromise. It wasn't until their third anniversary that the facade shattered. She'd overheard Liam on the phone, his voice low and conspiratorial. At first, she thought he was planning a surprise. But the words she caught made her stomach drop. She doesn't need to know. It's not like she'd understand. The affair came to light soon after, but it wasn't just the betrayal of another woman. It was the betrayal of everything. He'd used her, discarded her, and made sure she left the ranch with nothing. No settlement, no belongings, just the ache of knowing she'd been a pawn in his game. The years that followed were hard. Claire rebuilt her life in a modest apartment, working long hours at a job she hated. But the pain had forged something new in her, a quiet, unyielding strength. Liam had taken everything, but he hadn't broken her. Now, as she stood on the threshold of Silver Creek Rancho again, she wasn't the naive woman who had walked through those gates years ago. This time, she wasn't here to be welcomed. William Bennett, Liam's father and late ranch owner, passed away a few weeks ago, and his lawyer invited Claire for William's will reading. The door swung open before she could knock. "Claire!" His voice was the same, smooth and calculated, but the warmth she once craved was gone. Liam stood in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light. His face was a portrait of disdain. "Didn't think you'd actually show up." "Surprise," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. She brushed past him, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the pristine tile. If he wanted a fight, she wouldn't disappoint. Inside, the familiar scents of leather and cedar filled the air, mingling with the faint bitterness of cigar smoke. Around the grand dining table stood the people who had once been her family, or so she'd believed. Liam's new wife, Marissa, was perched on a chair like a viper waiting to strike. Others stared at her with barely concealed contempt. Claire squared her shoulders. Let them glare. She wasn't here to apologize. The lawyer, a stiff man with glasses perched precariously on his nose, cleared his throat. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin." And just like that, the storm outside felt tame compared to the one brewing in the room. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that seeped into the walls and made the air heavy. Claire sat stiffly in the leather armchair, her damp coat draped over the back. Across from her, Liam leaned casually against the fireplace mantel, his expression smug and indifferent. Marissa, his perfectly polished wife, sat beside him, her manicured nails tapping an impatient rhythm on the armrest of her chair. The lawyer, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, stood at the head of the grand dining table, shuffling papers with methodical precision. His glasses slid down his nose as he cleared his throat for what felt like the 100th time. "I'll keep this brief," he began, his voice flat and professional. William Bennett was a man who valued hard work, loyalty, and family. His will reflects those principles. "Get on with it," Liam muttered, earning a sharp glare from the lawyer. Claire's gaze flicked to Liam. She recognized the impatience in his tone. It wasn't grief. It was the eagerness of a man ready to claim what he thought was rightfully his. "As per the terms of Mr. Bennett's will," the lawyer continued, his voice steady, "the entirety of Silver Creek Rancho, including all assets and properties, will be inherited by—" He paused, glancing at the paper, and for the first time, his professional mask slipped, revealing a flicker of discomfort. "Claire Bennett." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. "What?" Liam's voice was sharp, cutting through the stunned silence. He pushed off the mantel, his face twisting with disbelief. "That's impossible. There's no way." William made his intentions very clear, the lawyer interrupted, his tone firm. "Silver Creek Rancho is to be passed to Claire Bennett under the condition that she resides on the property for a minimum of 6 months. "This is ridiculous." Marissa's voice was shrill, her perfect composure cracking. "She doesn't belong here. She left years ago." Claire sat frozen, the words struggling to sink in. Inherited the ranch? It didn't make sense. William had barely tolerated her when she was married to Liam. Why would he leave her everything? "This has to be a mistake," Liam growled, stepping toward the table. "Let me see that." The lawyer held up a hand, stopping him. "It's all in writing, Mr. Bennett. Your father was very clear. Should Ms. Bennett fail to meet the residency requirement, the property will then pass to you." Liam turned his glare on Claire, his eyes dark with fury. "You can't honestly think you're going to stay here?" he spat. "You've got no claim to this place. No right." Claire straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze head-on. The years of being intimidated by him were long behind her. "According to your father, I do." Her voice was calm but cold, her words laced with a challenge. "You won't last a week," he sneered. "Try me." The tension tightened, the room silent except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the windows. Finally, the lawyer spoke again, breaking the standoff. "If there are no further questions, I'll proceed with the formalities." Liam let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he stalked toward the door. "This isn't over, Claire," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "I never thought it would be," she replied, watching him go. As the door slammed behind him, Claire allowed herself a small, shaky breath. She didn't know what game William Bennett had been playing by leaving her the ranch, but she wasn't about to back down. Not this time. That night, Claire stayed at the ranch. The rain had turned to a soft drizzle by the time Claire ventured into the study, a room she hadn't dared to step into since her return. It was William Bennett's sanctuary, filled with mahogany bookshelves, old maps, and the faint scent of pipe tobacco that seemed to linger no matter how much time had passed. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Closure, perhaps? Answers? Or maybe just a distraction from the weight of her newfound responsibilities. The ranch was hers, but it felt more like a burden than a blessing. A stray draft caught her attention, rustling a stack of yellowed papers on the desk. Claire hesitated, then approached, her fingers brushing the edges of the pages. Beneath the stack was a small wooden box, its surface scratched and worn. She opened it, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her breath caught. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakable, William's. Each one was addressed to her. She slid the ribbon off with trembling hands and unfolded the top letter. The words leapt off the page, sharp and deliberate, just like the man who had written them. "Claire, if you're reading this, it means the ranch is now in your hands. I imagine you're confused, maybe even angry. I wouldn't blame you. But there are things you don't know, things I should have said long ago. This ranch isn't just a piece of land, it's a lifeline, a legacy, and for you, a second chance." Her chest tightened. She read on, devouring each letter, each revelation. William had known about Liam's betrayal, his lies, his infidelities, and had watched in silence as Claire's marriage crumbled. He'd admired her resilience, her quiet strength, even as she walked away from everything. But the letters revealed more than sympathy. They spoke of regret, of a man who had spent years trying to atone for his coldness, his stubborn pride. William had seen Claire as more than his son's ex-wife. He'd seen her as the only person capable of keeping the ranch alive. "The land is tough, Claire, but so are you. I trust you to make it thrive, to make it your own. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that this place can heal the parts of you were broken." Tears blurred her vision as she folded the last letter and placed it back in the box. The weight of the inheritance shifted slightly. No longer just a responsibility, but a gift. One she wasn't sure she deserved, but felt compelled to honor. The first weeks were brutal. Claire had underestimated how much work the ranch required. The mornings came too early, the days stretched too long, and her body ached in places she didn't even know existed. Fences needed mending, cattle needed tending, and the financial ledgers William had left behind painted a grim picture. The ranch was on the brink of collapse. More than once, she thought about giving up, about packing her bags and walking away. The voices of doubt were loud and relentless. Liam's taunts echoed in her mind, feeding the insecurities that had lingered since her divorce. But then there were moments, small, fleeting victories, that kept her going. The first time she repaired a section of fence on her own, her hands raw and blistered. The unexpected kindness of Javier, the ranch foreman, who stayed late to teach her how to wrangle cattle. The satisfaction of balancing the books late at night, finding a way to stretch every dollar just a little further. And then there was the land itself. The sunsets over the sprawling pastures, the quiet hum of the cicadas, the crisp morning air that carried the scent of earth and wildflowers. It reminded her why she had fallen in love with this place so many years ago. But growth wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She began to confront the wounds Liam had left behind, the way his betrayal had shattered her self-worth. Slowly, she started to rebuild herself, piece by piece. The letters from William became her guide, his words a steady presence in her darkest moments. When Liam returned demanding to buy her out, she stood her ground. His threats no longer had power over her. "This ranch isn't for sale," she told him, her voice firm and unwavering. "And neither am I." For the first time in years, she felt like the person William had seen in her letters, a woman of strength, resilience, and unyielding determination. Claire wasn't just surviving, she was growing, thriving, and the ranch was beginning to thrive with her. The knock on the front door came as Claire was finishing her morning coffee, the sun barely cresting over the horizon. She knew who it was before she opened it. Liam stood there, polished as ever in his tailored blazer and crisp shirt. His smile was tight, forced, the way it always was when he wanted something. "Claire," he greeted, his voice slick with condescension. "May I come in?" She stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. The last thing she wanted was his energy tainting the home she was beginning to make her own. "What do you want, Liam?" she asked, crossing her arms. His expression shifted to mock surprise. "Is that any way to talk to an old friend? I came to see how you're managing with all this." He gestured vaguely toward the ranch, as if it were beneath his notice. "I'm managing just fine," she replied coolly. He chuckled, a low sound that prickled her nerves. "Claire, let's not pretend this is your world. You're out of your depth here. Running a ranch? Balancing budgets? You don't have the skills for it. But lucky for you, I have a solution." Her stomach tightened as he pulled a folder from his leather briefcase and held it out to her. "This is my offer," he said smoothly. "It's generous, considering the condition this place is in. Sell me the ranch, and you can walk away with more money than you've ever dreamed of. You won't have to deal with the stress or the work. You can move on, Claire. Start fresh." She didn't take the folder. "This isn't about the ranch, is it? It's about control. You can't stand the fact that I have something you want, something you think you're entitled to." Liam's mask slipped, revealing the man beneath, the one she'd spent years trying to please, only to be torn down at every turn. His jaw tightened, and his voice turned icy. "Don't be naive. This land is wasted on you. Do you even know how much debt William left behind? How much it'll take to keep this place afloat? You think you're winning by staying here, but you're just digging yourself a deeper hole." Claire stared at him, her heart pounding, but she refused to let him see her falter. "You think I can't handle this? Watch me." His laugh was sharp, cruel. "This isn't some fairy tale, Claire. You'll fail, and when you do, I'll be here to clean up the mess. But my offer won't be so generous next time." She stepped closer, her voice firm. "Get off my land, Liam, and don't come back." For a moment he didn't move, his eyes narrowing as if assessing whether she was bluffing. Then he shrugged, slipping the folder back into his briefcase. "Suit yourself," he said, turning on his heel. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Claire watched him walk away, her hands trembling with adrenaline. She knew he wasn't finished. Liam wasn't the type to take no for an answer, but she also knew she wasn't the same woman he'd walked all over for years. The battle had just begun, but for the first time, Claire felt ready to fight. The ranch, bathed in golden sunlight, buzzed with life and activity. The hum of machinery blended with the rhythmic beat of hooves against the ground, and laughter carried on the wind. Claire stood by the newly painted barn, watching as the workers, now her team, moved with purpose and pride. It had taken months of grueling work, sleepless nights, and moments of self-doubt, but the transformation was undeniable. The ranch was no longer a decaying relic of the past. It was thriving, a harmonious blend of tradition and modern efficiency. Claire had poured her heart into every decision. She'd worked alongside Hank to modernize the irrigation system, invested in renewable energy, and introduced sustainable farming practices that boosted productivity without compromising the land's integrity. She'd opened the ranch to visitors, offering guided tours, horseback riding lessons, and a farm-to-table cafe that showcased their organic produce. The community, initially skeptical, had come around. They admired her tenacity and the respect she showed for the land's legacy. Slowly, they started showing up, supporting the ranch, recommending it to friends, and even volunteering during busy seasons. As the day wound down, Hank approached, wiping his hands on a rag. His face, lined with years of hard work, broke into a smile. "You did it, Claire," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. She smiled back, her chest swelling with pride. "We did it, Hank. I couldn't have done any of this without you." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "William would have been proud. He always said this place needed someone with vision, and you've got that in spades." Later that evening, Claire sat on the porch of the main house, the horizon painted in shades of orange and pink. She held a weathered envelope in her hands, William's final letter, the last she'd found among his papers. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the page, the familiar loops of his handwriting bringing a lump to her throat. "My dearest Claire," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've made the decision to stay. You've always had more strength and determination than you realized, and I knew you'd find your way here, to this land, to this life." Tears blurred her vision as she read on. "This ranch has always been more than a business. It's a sanctuary, a place where people come to heal, to find themselves. And now it's yours. Do with it what you will, but never doubt your ability to create something extraordinary. You've always been capable of greatness, Claire. I only wish I could be there to see it." The letter ended with a line that pierced her heart. "Find peace, my dear. Find happiness. You deserve nothing less." She pressed the letter to her chest, the weight of her journey crashing over her. She thought of the woman she'd been when she first arrived, a shadow of herself, burdened by fear and doubt. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had faced down her demons and carved out a life worth living. Looking out at the ranch, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for William, for the land, for the people who had stood by her, and for herself, for refusing to give up. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Claire smiled, a quiet, contented smile. She was finally home. The night air was cool and fragrant, carrying the faint scent of sage and freshly tilled earth. Claire stood on the balcony of the rancho's main house, her hands resting on the worn wooden railing. Below her, the ranch stretched wide and vibrant under a silver moon. She could see the distant glow of the barn, where the last of the workers were finishing their tasks for the evening. The soft murmur of their voices carried up to her, mingling with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a symphony of life, of effort, of something she had helped create. Her gaze swept over the fields, where rows of healthy crops swayed gently. The pastures were dotted with grazing horses, their silhouettes serene against the star-speckled sky. It wasn't just a ranch. It was a testament to everything she had endured and overcome. For so long, the rancho had been a place of pain, a reminder of the betrayal and loss that had shattered her world. But now, it stood as a beacon of resilience. The land didn't just survive, it flourished. And so had she. Claire took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill her lungs. She thought about William's letter and his faith in her, even in his absence. She thought about Hank, the workers, and the community that had become her family. And she thought about herself, the woman who had arrived here broken and uncertain, and the one who now stood strong, proud, and unafraid. As the wind tousled her hair, Claire allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Triumph and peace filled her heart. But a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered of new possibilities. There was still so much to do, so much to explore. The rancho was her anchor, but it didn't have to be her boundary. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Hank stepped onto the balcony, a bottle of wine in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. "Thought you might want to toast your victory," he said, his eyes twinkling. Claire smiled and took a glass as he poured. They clinked their glasses together, the quiet sound punctuating the stillness of the night. "To the rancho," Hank said. "To new beginnings," Claire added. As they sipped their wine, Claire looked out at the land one more time. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength that had brought her here. This was her home, her sanctuary, her triumph, and it was only the beginning.